Hi, we enter into Genesis 33 today as we continue this two-chapter unit of Genesis 32 and 33 of Jacob preparing for the reunion with his brother Esau, which of course he's expecting could be murderous, and Esau has other plans, as we'll see. So as we enter into this, we see on the right side of the screen the shape of the whole Jacob story, and as we enter into chapter 33 here, we know that this follows right after the wrestling scene with whoever Jacob was wrestling with, perhaps some aspect of Esau, but as I was trying to show in the last video, there's no need to determine exactly who that was, whether it was God or an angel or something else. The story, like so many stories in Genesis and the Hebrew Bible, is meant to be ambiguous, so we can read it at multiple levels, even though so many scholars find a need to try to reduce it down to one answer. And similarly here in this scene, because we know the character of Esau only from what we saw back in these early chapters, when he so crudely demanded food, the red stuff after coming in from the hunt, and then was absent when Jacob went to his father, whether there was a trick or not, we have to look back to that and see, and got the blessing that was intended for Esau. And as I was noting at the time, the paternal blessing was actually meaningless. The only blessing that Genesis really recognizes as real is the blessing from God. God has the power to bring about fertility, and that's what barakah, the word for blessing in Hebrew, signifies, whether that's fertility of the earth or fertility of the human body or fertility of the community of Israel as it will be as a whole. We saw in the Laban unit here that the Mesopotamians saw that as an expression of material benefit. So when Laban saw the camels, he said, "Blessed are you of Yahweh." And one of the aspects of what we want to look at here is how the story has shown many different backgrounds of the audience, potentially in the present time of exile, with Laban symbolizing Mesopotamia, but also in the two cities that we saw, whether Bethel here or Penuel here, that were gathered around the time of the late monarchy when Josiah was trying to take down what the southern perspective seen in 1st and 2nd Kings calls the sins of Jeroboam, which is to lead the Israelites to worship Yahweh at places other than Jerusalem. So we saw the very, as I call it, the religion of creation response was, in Josiah's sense, was to destroy all the priests that allowed people to worship other places and to destroy all those high places. But we've already seen Jacob in a high place, and we saw that Bethel was the site of Josiah's reform, and yet Jacob's experience there was, God is in this place and I didn't know it. Similarly, at Penuel, we saw that 1 Kings 12:25 says Penuel was built by Jeroboam, the very king that set up the altars that Josiah was so busy to destroy. And so we see that Genesis is not supporting the Jerusalem-centered worship, but it's suggesting that the Creator Yahweh can be worshipped and experienced everywhere. And certainly Jacob has experienced that both in the supposed ladder vision that was also like a road, but also in the wrestling experience. Now, as he gathers back with Edom, we see a different angle. What is the relationship with the people of the land? And although generally texts like Deuteronomy 7, as you can see here, call for the destruction of all the people of the land, like they were, as if we would call today, a virus, something that you could catch and be contagious, surprisingly, we see this little verse here in Deuteronomy 23, which has a different sense about Edom as family. If Deuteronomy is written at the same time as Joshua, and roughly there to justify Josiah's reform in the 620s or so before the Common Era, then that's just before the exile, and Genesis would know that or something like it. So the sense that the Deuteronomistic text allows for people of the Edomite lineage on the third generation to be united to the people of Israel sets up something here for a potential reunion. But within the story dynamics, we see nothing about that. We've simply seen that Esau is Edom, and we'll see it two more times in the chapters that follow that closes our unit in Genesis 35 and 36. So we as readers might well expect that Israel, represented by Jacob, and Edom, represented by Esau, have some very harsh connection here, as we see, for example, in 2 Samuel 8, where David takes down the Edomites, and there's a lot of historical context for that, but we won't get that here. Here you can get that in my 2 Samuel series, where we're looking at that chapter from the other direction, relationship with Genesis. So that's a little bit of our context here as we look at the many levels of our story between the two brothers playing out the narrative of two nations are in your womb, but they're two brothers, and then the two nations of Israel and Edom playing outside the text of Genesis itself. One of the tools we've been looking at here is the way the text brings together word plays that suggest other people, other characters. So as we saw Last time you've striven was Sarita, sort of like Sarah, and we saw the play on Rachel's Rechalim and the play on Laban up here. Today it's a little different. The section we're going to see here is echoing a number of things from chapter 27, and I'll put up here, you can see this little chart that shows all those, and we'll look at that as we go. But there's also the play on words we'll see here, and not today, that please accept my gift after we'd seen the word present, which is barakah, the blessing. So we see that now we can know in advance that what Jacob's about is trying to repent in some way by returning the blessing, and yet that's not what will happen. Let's look at our key words for our chapter, and we'll see that the first two parts form nice chiasms here, an ABA chiasm, as you can see here, and you can see it very clearly with the children there and the bowing there and the reunion in the middle. And then this five-part chiasm, ABCBA here, where the center is to see your face is like seeing the face of God, which is a key verse not only for understanding their relationship here, but going back and reinterpreting the wrestling story, as I was suggesting in that story. And then here we have just the end of the text, which does not have a chiastic sort of structure. And many scholars separate this out at the end here as separate, but I included the whole chapter here. And I'll include chapter 34 in what we look at, even though many scholars think this whole journey to Sukkoth and what happens in Shechem was added later. But as often the case when we read it as an integrated narrative, it will all make perfect sense together. So let's leave our key words in our text up on the left side, and we'll begin to enter in our passage. So now, immediately, Jacob looked up and saw Esau. But if I scroll up a couple verses to see where we were, we recall that the wrestling had taken place here. He'd already sent the animals as presents in flocks, spaced them out, and then he sent the 4 women and the children ahead and crossed the river in the middle of the night. So last we saw, the sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, but he's still on the other side of the Jabbok. But now he's obviously crossed over somehow without anything being mentioned about that, because he's reunited with the women, who again have nothing to say here. And as I was noting earlier when he directed them across and they had nothing to say, Leah and Rachel have been very active characters early on, whether it's around the childbirth issues or Rachel right in the beginning when Rebecca was pregnant with them. That wasn't Leah and Rachel. But we've seen Rachel suggest to Jacob that he could help get her pregnant, and they had discussions. So Leah and Rachel have been active characters, but here they're not, because the Esau story is really not about them, even though their lives are at risk. It's about whether Jacob can make out a safe way to return to his brother. So now Jacob looked up and saw, using a phrase that we see many times in Genesis and throughout the Hebrew Bible, matching and contrasting with Esau in verse 5, as we'll see here, when Esau looked up and saw, and that's part of the other side of the chiasm. As so often the Norse V leaves out Gehenna, and behold. So Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming, behold, right away. So as I was discussing in the last videos, we didn't know how far Esau was away, and since Jacob's messengers went to Esau and came back, Esau couldn't be too far away, but here he is right away with his 400 men. And as we can imagine, Jacob is still terrified, having no reason to believe that Esau is anything other than revenge. But one of the key aspects of this story and about Genesis overall is that people can change. We saw the character of Abraham grow from the very beginning all the way through to the end, and the character of Jacob isn't necessarily who he started with either. And although we've not heard the narrative of Esau's life in all the years they've been apart, it would be our own prejudice to assume that after all these decades, Esau has not changed one bit and is still carrying the murderous desire for revenge that we saw him have Jacob depart with way back in the beginning of chapter 28. So we'll see how that plays out here. So Esau saw coming with the 400 men, and so Jacob divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 maids. And I've been noting maids is just an unnecessarily derogatory term. I refer to them as secondary women here, and I'm sorry I didn't replace it there. I'll replace it before I post this at radicalbible.net. I got this one and not that one. So put the secondary women in front. And notice the order he puts them in here, as my note there has. He put the secondary women with their children in front, Lishanah here, matching the first messenger that he reported, sent the instructions to in 32:18. Then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. Plainly seeing that from the very beginning when he fell in love with Rachel at the well, she's been his favorite. And the only child of Rachel so far is Joseph. Benjamin will be born in chapter 35, and Rachel will die in childbirth on the way. And so Joseph's the only one mentioned here, and of course he's the only one that will get his own unit of stories, starting in chapter 37, coming up soon. Although the other brothers are well involved, and as we'll see, the narrator says this is the story of the children of Jacob, although it's often called the Joseph story. So, having sent them ahead, then we see this. And it's an interesting element because when he sent all the animals ahead, he sent the animals first and then the women and children, and he held back. But now he's going on ahead of him. And many interpreters want to make more of that than perhaps can be made of it. As Wenham suggests, it shows us the new Israel triumphs over the old fear-dominated Jacob. But I think that's saying way too much here because Jacob is still plenty afraid of Esau, as we'll see as the scene unfolds. Wenham sees the name Israel as turning Jacob into a hero. But a name doesn't make somebody a hero. We'll have to see his actions. And Jacob's actions not only here are not heroic, they're even less heroic in chapter 34, as we'll see. So he went on ahead of them, literally before their faces, carrying out the face theme that we saw before with the 4 faces we saw in the previous chapter and the faces we're going to see here. Bowing himself to the ground 7 times. Plainly, this is like a royal ritual greeting a king. The 7 times here, as Westerman notes, off-occurring formula in the Amarna letters. If you don't know what those are, don't worry about it. But a packet of archaeologically discovered letters that tell us something about the ancient world. And the formula there is, I fall prostrate at the feet of my Lord 7 and 7 times. And maybe that's relevant, but there's my note below has 7 times is used 29 times in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text, and all for rituals of one kind or another, especially in Leviticus and Numbers, but not just there. So it's certainly something the audience would be familiar with, a ritual of bowing to the ground 7 times, until he came near his brother. So if we picture the scene, he's ahead of the women and children. We don't know where all the animals are. They presumably went on ahead, but we don't see them here. And he's gone on ahead, and yet Esau and his 400 men are still at some distance. Now till he came to his brother. And this is where we can see the coming near echoes so many aspects from the scene where Jacob stole the scene from Esau back in chapter 29, as you can see here. And we'll look at the details as we go. So until he came near his brother, but Esau takes the initiative. And for readers of the New Testament, we can hear the echoes of the prodigal son returning and the father running out, carrying all these same verses. He ran, he embraced him, and he fell on his neck. So Luke certainly had this scene of reconciliation in mind, although that's between the father and son, not the 2 brothers. And in Luke's story, the 2 brothers are not reconciled. So let's go down to see the rest of our scene here through verse 7. So Esau ran to meet him, and we don't know how old exactly Esau is here, although we could guess, I suppose. Well, of course, he's the same age as Jacob, isn't he, now that I think about that? So whatever it is, he's not a young man. You can calculate it, and the age is available, but I just hadn't done it here. But he certainly has Jacob has young adult children and younger children, so this would not be a dignified thing any more than it was for the father of the prodigal son in Luke 15 to run, but he does. He doesn't say he came off a horse or off a donkey, so we don't picture him on that, but he's just running, not literally to meet him, but to call him, which is an interesting thing here, using Korah there, the word to call, and embraced him. Havak here, which we saw in the previous scene of embrace there, embracing the father, and we'll see it one more time. And notice how close this is to wrestling, the coming close with the bodily encounter here, and as suggesting it's one of the elements in which we can imagine that Jacob was wrestling with some aspect of Esau in his own internal sense, and fell on his neck, as Joseph will do in chapter 46, and kissed him. Echoing 27:26 as we saw. And the Norsvi has they wept, but as Park notes, the verb is singular. And so Esau alone weeps, and Jacob remains impassive. So all these verbs apply to Esau here. He ran, he called, he embraced, he fell, and he kissed, and he wept. And that's really important because it highlights that Jacob isn't sure what to do yet about this, and that will play out in the next scene that we'll see, and the third scene as well. So as Park notes the ambiguous nature of Esau's questions, he thinks Jacob is a trickster, which he's carefully observing for any possible tricks. I want to go back here to the previous note in verse 4, which I hadn't noted here. As Westerman notes, the gestures are of great significance in the world in which this story takes place. There is silence with regard to the explicit concepts of confession and forgiveness, but in the silence a modest restraint is at work, which testifies to a deep human awareness. And that's an astute comment on Westerman's part, who's often more about taking the text apart with different sources of J, E, and P and such. So a nice observation there on the emotions of the situation. So after Esau does all these things, then Esau looks up and saw the women and children. So Jacob looked up and saw Esau and 400 men, looking like an army. And when Esau looks up, he sees the women and children whom he hadn't known about. He had sent the animals, and he had sent the message that he has all kinds of other animals, but this is a big surprise. And so he asked 3 questions here. Who are these with you? Or I'm sorry, 1 question with you. Who are these with you? The 3 questions were the ones that Jacob told the servants to anticipate that Jacob would ask. But he only asked these. Who are these with you? And matching Jacob's first question there. So, as I note below, where Jacob sees a threatening army, Esau sees a thriving family. So who are these with you? Again, noting the description of the messengers. And Jacob answers, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Graciously given, using the word hanan here. As Westerman notes, could include the forgiving grace. The verb barak for blessing could not. Although forgiving grace is certainly a Christian way to look at this, not a language that Genesis uses. As Wenham notes, avoids reminding Esau of the bad memory of Jacob's blessing here, of using hanan. But he will bring it up explicitly because he will use the word blessing himself, as we'll see right down here in the next scene. Again, speaking of himself in the third person and not seeing him as an equal, and he will refer to him as Esau as Lord, as we'll see in the next scene. So although Esau is coming up to him and embracing him like a brother, Jacob is still maintaining some distance and calling him servant. And so, without any specific suggestion it should happen, the secondary wives drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. And then we see that Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down, and finally Joseph and Rachel drew near. Notice how it says Joseph first rather than Rachel, even though he's just a young child here. The others have the women first and then children, but it has Joseph first before Rachel. We don't hear that Jacob told them to do this, so this is the first thing they're doing as an initiative, and they're bowing down, of course, here in the feminine form, suggests that only the women bowed, not the children. Another astute observation from Park. So just as it was only Esau was weeping, it appears to be only the women who are bowing down. And the commas here could suggest that the maids drew near and bowed down, but they and their children drew near. And so finally Joseph and Rachel drew near and they bowed down. And what will happen now when this meeting follows the next step? We might expect, based on what we saw with Jacob and Laban and in the previous unit, that they'd have some kind of meal and they'd have some kind of agreement and they would spend time together. Or it would be like when the servant came to Laban's house and he wanted to leave and they told him to stay for a few more days in the traditional provisions of hospitality. But that's not what's going to happen here, and we'll have to look and see what it is next time. See you then. Bye-bye.